Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Marty Olliff, director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. Dr. Olliff, we are here today to discuss a posting of yours from the Troy University blog, of course, where we post It Came from the Archives in text form. And this one is one that will be of particular interest to residents of the Wiregrass and the Circle City of Dothan. Tell us a little bit about kind of what we're talking about here today.
Sure. The Wiregrass Archives was lucky enough a number of years ago to acquire a collection from a fellow named Bill Church. And it's 178 3.5 by 5.5 photographic prints of a neighborhood that's called either Southside if you're nice about it, or Frogtown if you're not so nice about it, meaning it's an old African-American neighborhood developed in the 1920s, I believe, maybe a little bit earlier. I've seen references to the neighborhood in a newspaper from Dothan as early as 1909, but it's an area that is south of Main Street and west of the downtown core. It's along Alice Street. If you're familiar with Dothan, it's really at the intersection of South Alice Street and where Fortner now intersects Alice. The neighborhood now looks very different than it did in the 1920s through the 1950s. And what these photographs were, and they're all dated March 1958, were photographs that were taken of that neighborhood so the property could be appraised for the purposes of the city buying it and then using federal grant and aid money to do what a little earlier had been called slum clearance, but by 1958 was being called urban renewal. So, and the neighborhood that replaced Frogtown or Southside is still referred to in the tax records as the Urban Renewal District. And it's, as far as I can tell, the only one in Dothan.
There's a story within this story. Do we want to get into that first before we get into the details of the Southside development there?
Well, I think you're talking about how we acquired this collection, or how Bill Church acquired
Absolutely.
This collection. Now, I wish I could tell you when he did this, but let me make an aside. Every archivist has a story like this. Every archives has acquired at least one of its collections in a manner similar to what I'm about to tell you. So this is not apocryphal. This actually happens, and it's fairly well known in the archival community as one of the ways we get collections. Bill Church was visiting with either a friend or a cousin, or a friend who was a cousin, or a cousin who was a friend, it's hard to say, who had the task of cleaning out a house that the owners had passed away and the children didn't, they were getting ready to sell the house. And so they were just cleaning the stuff out of the house. And what this guy was doing, this workman was doing, was burning things in a burn pile. And as Bill Church was standing there jaw-jacking with this guy, the fellow picks up a bunch of things, a big handful, and he's about to throw them into the fire. And Bill told me that he grabbed the man's hand as he was making the motion to toss these in the fire, and he said, "Wait a minute, what are those?" That turned out to be a big packet of photographs, and Bill thumbed through them real fast and said, "Oh, I know what this is." And he said, "Let me have those." Well, Church got a hold of me, and so he donates these photographs. We begin to go through them. He knew basically what was going on, But as my staff and I began to go through them, we began to understand that they are in some kind of order. It looks like, and you can tell in little batches of these photographs, that the photographer would drive down the street and take one photograph after another. He'd drive 15 feet, take a photograph, drive 25 feet, take a photograph, and then he'd drive back up the other side. The person that did this is a fellow named Quay Fortner. And in 1958, he got a seat on the Dothan Planning Commission, which was fairly new, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And his job, because he was in real estate and insurance, was to go take these photographs so that the Dothan city could leverage some federal money. And it's the federal money that leads to this urban renewal district. I think that's what sparked the whole activity. The city saw that there was some money available. It saw an opportunity, a 2-for-1 match, two parts Fed, 1 part local. It saw an opportunity to revitalize an area that was very substandard. The housing was very substandard. Some of the houses were reasonably nice cottages, but lots and lots of them were very old. They were not well made to begin with. I just read an article from the 1920s today in the Dothan Eagle about a mosquito eradication program, a survey that the city had done, and they found 20 open wells. I'm sorry, I said this was from the 1920s. It's really from the late 1930s, early 1940s. They found 20 open and abandoned wells. This area was not on city water. I don't think it was on city sewage up until the urban renewal time.
Wow. The photographs in question of this area, the houses are in disrepair by and large. They look, they're kind of, I mean, there's one of them at least that was burned. Looked like it had been, consumed by fire, and it looks very much almost like 19th century instead of 20th century. So it's no surprise why these changes were needed. However, I did find it interesting in the article you mentioned that obviously this is a predominantly black area, and a lot of these families, it said they were either moved to other housing across town when this development was made, or were left to find their own, which is, that's a pretty tragic story.
Made even more tragic by the fact that the Housing Act of 1949, that was rewritten just a little bit to become the Housing Act of 1954, which is what this project was built on, specifically states that an entity that does a slum clearance or urban renewal has to relocate the folks that get displaced. It's the responsibility of the agency to relocate those folks. It's another responsibility to create housing of less than $9,000 in value. Now, that was an upper lower class or a lower middle class house in the late 1950s, $9,000. Now, what ended up happening was that the city bought all of this land. All of these folks were moved, and it took 2 or 3 years to do this. Then all of this area was bulldozed. Streets, houses, commercial buildings. There were 3 or 4 little groceries there, like the Davis Grocery and Fuller's Market and the Langham Grocery. There were 3 at least churches. There were probably 5 restaurants, some of which were as small as a little shack called the Boston Tea Room. And then there was another one almost across the street from the Boston Tea Room on Alice that was called the White Horse Restaurant. And it was 2 stories, but it was all corrugated metal siding. So, yeah, and the burned building that was still standing in these pictures that you talked about, I think that was either a market or a restaurant also. But yeah, 179 houses ultimately were flattened. 155 black families and 5 white families were moved. And the houses that they rebuilt in that area, they started out, the Planning Commission, the Housing Authority, and the city said, yeah, we'll put them in, yeah, we'll try to do them at $9,000. By the time they got them, they were $20,000. And
a gentrification.
Yeah. It's definitely federal money coming in to gentrify an area. And this was not uncommon. This was not limited to Dothan. And by the way, in 1956, when this project was really getting underway in Dothan, the Dothan Eagle reported that it was one of 19 urban renewal slum clearance projects in Alabama, that the earliest ones had begun in 1953 in Birmingham. But in the year 1956, 1957, 11 more had started up just in that one year. So this federal money from the 1954 Housing Act really jump-started what came to be called in the 60s and 70s urban renewal, and really what was called in the law in the 1950s urban renewal.
It's interesting. These photographs are really showing an area, because correct me if I'm wrong, but this area of Dothan that was built as part of urban renewal, that's kind of what we see there today, correct? Most of the houses and things of that nature were built in that time frame?
Yes, yeah. And the neighborhood streets were completely redesigned so that if you were to lay a plat of the former area on top of a plat of the current area, some of the buildings that you can see in these images would be in the backyards of some of the houses that are there now.
Wow.
The 1937 Housing Act said, which was a public housing act, said that for every house that was torn down, you had to build another housing unit. And by the same token, for every housing unit you wanted to put up, you had to tear down a substandard housing unit. Well, the 1949 Act began to do away with that, and the 1954 Act specified that you didn't have to replace housing units one for one, and that you could make an area that had been formerly residential, you could turn it into commercial space or other kinds of space. This worked in Birmingham particularly well because it allowed Birmingham to eradicate a slum and put up University of Alabama at Birmingham Medical Campus, which was a tremendous economic driver.
Right.
And so the literature I'm reading right now talks about how the law changed from a housing law in 1937 through 1949 that by 1954 had become an economic development law, because you could change the use of the land. It didn't have to be just residential.
One of the other things it mentions in your article is, which again can be found on the Troy Today blog, today.troy.edu, and it says there was road pavings going on. There was, it basically needed to be modernized. Unfortunately, in the process of this modernization, there was a lot of families that were left displaced.
Again, not uncommon, particularly in that period of time. There's a great historical literature, and by great I mean fairly vast historical literature, that all agrees that urban renewal projects and highway placement were frequently used by, particularly in southern cities and southern towns, to simply displace African Americans. And this is a fairly well-known phenomenon. The whole point was to run the poor folks into an area where they couldn't be seen. And to allude back to what you were saying earlier, not necessarily fulfill your obligations as a civic agency toward these individuals and these individual families.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave people with about this photograph collection and how they might be able to view this photo collection if they're interested? Because these are some fascinating historical documents for a city that means a lot to a lot of us.
One thing I would like to say is that there is one picture, and I can identify approximately where it was taken from, that looks at 5 or 6 houses in, I want to say, the 500 block of South Alice Street. And it's just, instead of taking one lot after another, these houses all look alike, and so almost like a mill village. And so Coy Fortner just took this one photograph, and in the photograph is, in addition to the houses and the street, the sidewalk and the cars and evidence of life, there's a telephone pole with, looks like some kind of poster on it. I was able to expand that enough that I could see that that was a Wallace for Governor 1958 political campaign ad, a political poster in this neighborhood. That was the campaign that his first gubernatorial campaign that he lost to John Patterson, in which he said he would never be out-segged again. Dan Carter, in his book Politics of Rage, makes a pretty good case that George was not quite that nice about it, that he used the N-word. And that was kind of a contention in the Wallace mythology, in his biographies. What did he say about that? Well, that was the campaign where he was the racial moderate, and Patterson was the racial demagogue. And he said, hey, I know what's going to get me elected. And so that's what he ran on in 62. And that's what led to Asa Carter's written speech, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Wow.
But the photographs are all digitized. They're all available online through the Wiregrass Archives website. You have to, from the homepage, you have to go down to the online finding aids, online guides to the collections, and then look for the church collection. That's the donor's last name. And they're all digitized, and if you click on them, you should be able to get a larger version of the image so you can see it pretty well. And we've tried to explain what's going on in these as best we knew at the time that we put them up. But I think they are a tremendous visual record of not just a time in the past, but a very specific time, and not just 1958. Yeah, these were taken in 1958, so you have some very contemporary things like that Wallace banner. But you're looking at 30 years, 40 years of history, 50 years of history before then in the built environment. And if you are used to seeing neighborhoods and developments and suburbs and sections of town built since the 1960s, then you will marvel at just how little planning there was in the various kinds of buildings that there were. It's a mixed-use neighborhood. There was not any heavy manufacturing, but right on the edge of the neighborhood was a cotton gin for a long time. On the very edge of the neighborhood was a sawmill called the Williams-Voris Lumber Company. And I always thought that a bunch of the people in the neighborhood would work there, but they didn't. Very few of them actually worked at the Williams-Voris Lumber Company. They tended to work more in town. But you can use these things. You can download them, make use of them however you care to make use. We'd love a credit if you do anything more than use them for yourself.
Absolutely.
But I think they make a pretty compelling and interesting view of what life was like in the mid and earlier 20th century.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass Archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. That helps other people find this show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olliff, director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.